Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. Order. We are delighted to be joined this morning by colleagues from the Groceries Code Adjudicator and the Agricultural Supply Chain Adjudicator. Welcome, gentlemen. Can I just, for the benefit of those who are following our proceedings and indeed for our own official record, invite you to give us your names and your roles, please. Richard, I'll take you first.
Yes, Richard Thompson, the Agricultural Supply Chain Adjudicator at DEFRA.
Thank you, Chair. Mark White, Groceries Code Adjudicator.
Okay, well, you're both very welcome, and indeed it has turned out to be a timely appearance for all manner of reasons, not least, Mark, because you're now going to be coming under the umbrella of DEFRA rather than the Department for Business and Trade. So, welcome to the DEFRA family.
Thank you very much.
You're one of ours now.
Thank you.
And quite apart from that, there are, of course, any number of pressures on household budgets coming from geopolitical events, which we will touch on later, no doubt, with yourself and others who are appearing. But first of all, I want to look at the question of the respective roles of the GCA and the ASCA this morning. And we'll start with you, Mark, if I can. Can we just go right back to ground zero and the code of practice? The mischiefs that code of practice are designed to address include harmful conduct such as the retrospective variation of supply agreements, delay in payments and ceasing or significantly reducing the volume of purchases without a genuine commercial reason and or without giving reasonable notice. Is that still roughly the areas in which you are operating?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the code applies to the direct suppliers of groceries to the retailers who are designated by the Competition and Markets Authority to fall under the code. My role is to enforce the code and encourage compliance with the code. The code was needed to prevent retailers with buyer power from transferring excessive risks and unexpected costs onto their suppliers, and the code has led to fairer relationships between suppliers and the 14 retailers. And as you've already mentioned, Chair, one of the examples is delisting as a specific issue, so retailers are not able to delist products from purchase from suppliers unless they have genuine commercial reasons and give suppliers reasonable notice.
And your view is that you've made a difference in that regard?
I believe that there has been a difference. So
recently, in relation to a court case in which you intervened, you described the code of practice as gold standard.
That's correct, yes.
So is this as good as it gets in terms of market regulation?
I believe that it is good as it gets within the remit that has been given to me.
All right, okay, so it's not quite the same thing. So what are the remedies then that you have at your hand?
So I spend a considerable time engaging with suppliers to understand what their concerns are, taking those suppliers' issues to the retailers to seek to resolve the issues at hand. Ultimately, if the issues are not resolved, there are various methods by which suppliers may seek redress. So I might launch an investigation, for example, if I have a reasonable suspicion to believe that a retailer has breached the code. Suppliers are free to come to me and ask me to arbitrate in a code-related dispute that they have with a retailer. Suppliers are also able to launch civil litigation against retailers, as you mentioned, Chair, the High Court case last year.
Yeah, you're doing a fairly significant job then on quite a limited budget. What's your budget now?
So the budget that I raised a couple of weeks ago was £3.5 million.
Sorry, I missed that.
£3.5 million.
And previously it was?
£2.2 million.
And that comes from a levy on supermarkets.
It is a mandatory levy on the supermarkets.
You set the levy and it's approved by the Secretary of State, is
Indeed.
that correct?
Indeed.
And how many staff do you engage on that budget?
I have 9 colleagues who are seconded from other government departments.
Okay. Now, with that 9 staff, you've had, since you were founded 13 years ago, 2 formal investigations and 13 arbitrations. Is that correct?
So the up-to-date figures are 3 investigations. And
you've now started one into Amazon.
I have indeed.
Right.
And 15 arbitrations, one of which is currently ongoing.
Okay. As a gold standard, is that the extent of the difficulties in the supply chain? For 13 years, 15 arbitrations and 3 investigations. Is it a market really with no problems?
So I do what works to drive up compliance amongst the retailers. My priorities are informed by what suppliers tell me confidentially through my annual survey and what they tell me directly. My collaborative approach with the retailers enables me to vary my engagement proportionately with the retailers without breaching suppliers' confidentiality. So engaging with the retailers before suppliers have suffered any detriment, before they have incurred any cost, and it is a method of securing prevention before the fact rather than cure after the fact. Whilst
so, I mean, as you're describing it, essentially your approach is that you run with the foxes and ride with the hounds at the same time.
Indeed.
Is that one you think that inspires confidence?
I believe that it does. If you look at the results of my annual survey, which has been running since 2014, suppliers believe that retailers comply with the code at 92%, as revealed in my 2026 survey results that I published last week. That's nearly 20% increase from the first survey in 2014.
Mm-hmm. I mean, are you alive to the possibility that there are those who just don't feel that they can come forward?
Yeah, yes.
You are. And what are you doing to address it?
So I talk to all participants across the supply chain, whether they are direct suppliers to the 14 retailers or indirect suppliers. I keep everything that suppliers tell me completely confidential, as I'm required to by law. I need suppliers to raise issues in order to resolve their particular concerns with the retailers. So that's
where we come to the number of the issue, isn't it? People feeling that maybe they don't have confidence because you're taking what you describe as a collaborative approach with the retailers in the first place.
Well, I take a collaborative approach to get to resolution. So what I have done to encourage suppliers to come forward is secured a confidentiality commitment by each of the 14 code compliance officers. So these are employees appointed by each retailer to effectively be a point of contact with suppliers over code issues. What they have confirmed to me is that they will engage with suppliers on their issues completely in confidence, and the control about whether information is released wider into the retailer's business rests solely with the supplier. And I've backed that up with retailers' commitment to there being no negative consequences for any supplier who raises an issue.
What do you do to enforce that commitment?
So I work with each of the co-compliance officers to ensure that after the issue has been resolved with the supplier, the co-compliance officer is checking back in with the supplier to check that there has been no negative consequence as a result of the supplier coming forward. hopefully that the relationship has improved because of the engagement between the parties. And of course, I want to hear from any supplier confidentially if they believe that that commitment by the co-compliance officer or by the retailer has in any way been breached.
Okay. I mean, you'll be aware that there's been fairly widespread scepticism about the ability of the office to actually manage that relationship, to inspire confidence, to bring people forward. We referenced earlier the Clappison case, which is now resolved. I understand that it's something that's not, we can't put into the public domain. But can I read to you from an email that I received in relation to that case in March of last year? It says, in my case, Mark White's office pointed me in the direction of Aldi, that was the supermarket with which he had been delisted, who in turn said they'd done nothing wrong. At no time did I ever get any help or encouragement from the GCA, just when a bit of hand-holding and assurance would have gone a long way. Does that sound like the gold standard of market regulation in terms of this particular market?
Well, that is, obviously, I don't know the detail of that email, but it is very disappointing to hear. The co-compliance officers are very important in the context of resolving disputes between suppliers and retailers, and given the confidentiality commitment and the commitment to no negative consequences, they are ideally placed to deal initially with suppliers' concerns.
And are they doing that effectively enough?
I believe that they are. So they report to me regularly. As part of our collaborative approach, I meet with those co-compliance officers on a regular basis. I
mean, are you really alive to the consequences for businesses to bring these matters to your attention? I mean, Mr. Clappison at this point had already spent £200,000 in legal fees, and he was facing the prospect of a court action which was going to cost him at least £1 million. There's not many people in farming who've got the means or the determination to risk that.
So I understand the frustration that Mr. Clappison had. I applied to intervene in the High Court proceedings in order to assist the court with the interpretation of the code. And
that case eventually was concluded by a settlement when Aldi settled the case.
It was discontinued, yes.
Right. Having originally told Mr. Clappison that they had done nothing wrong.
I'm not aware of the individual detail of what the office may have said to Mr. Clappison.
Have you done any follow-up on that case?
I have met Mr. Clappison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you done follow-up on the specifics to look at how you dealt with the initial engagement and compared the outcome to the initial assertions of the supermarkets there?
I'm not aware of the detail of the settlement or the agreement which was reached, only the fact that the civil proceedings were discontinued. But we are always reviewing how we engage with suppliers and the assistance that we give them in order to resolve their issues.
So would your collaborative approach, do you think, allow supermarkets to discuss with you openly the actual outcome, notwithstanding their initial stance? Would that be a good collaborative approach?
Yes, so normally as part of the regular engagement with the CCOs, I would see the outcome that had been reached where there had been a dispute, for example, over reasonable notice and how long that should be, and the processes and the changes that the supermarkets have made to ensure that their processes are refined and enhanced.
Mm-hmm. How do the discussions go between yourselves and the supermarkets in relation to the levies?
The levy? So the levy is approved by the Secretary of State. It is imposed upon the retailers. I inform the retailers of the methodology that has been used in determining the levy, and as I say, I raised the invoice 2 weeks ago, and payments are beginning to come in.
Okay. And then when it comes to this point about making a decision about how to handle an individual case, what are the bases on which you decide about a formal investigation or an informal engagement?
So, Chair, I've described my collaborative approach with the retailers. The backstop is an investigation. So if the behaviour does not change after I've taken the issues to the retailer, or suppliers continue to come forward and report issues, at that point I would consider whether to launch an investigation.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a massive power imbalance here. You understand, you recognise, you accept that, do you not?
I do.
In the circumstances of pushing informal negotiations or informal engagement, you can understand why people who are supplying supermarkets would be reluctant to do that. Do you not?
I do.
But still you do it.
Because
Mr. Clapson was told, go and talk to Aldi.
The foundations of a good collaborative relationship between the retailer and supplier require communication. There will always be issues in the contracting relationship. It is more beneficial for retailers to engage with the suppliers directly to hear those issues, confidentially to resolve them.
Well, can I just say to you, by the time they come to speaking to you, do you not think they've maybe passed that stage?
It may well be the case. So I try.
You know, if you were sitting there as a police officer and I was asking you about the treatment of women making a complaint about coercive controlling behaviour, you wouldn't say go home, and you wouldn't expect a police officer to say go home and speak to your husband about this, would you?
So,
You see the parallel I'm drawing here.
I do.
But still you think that's the sensible opening point?
Supplier confidentiality is paramount in terms of the information flow to me and taking issues to the retailers. When a supplier has reached a point where they feel that they are not getting the traction with the retailer, there are options open to them in terms of arbitration or civil litigation.
Yeah, and this is where it comes down to the practicalities of it, isn't it? For Mr. Clapperson, he'd already spent £200,000. Aldi played litigation hardball in that case, didn't they?
I can't comment on the particular...
Well, I mean, you were moved to intervene.
Indeed.
Presumably because you felt there was a public interest to be served.
Indeed.
But do you think there would be many people in Mr. Clapperson's position who would bet the farm, to use the term, on going to court?
Well, I would hope that there are other avenues that suppliers could
This
adopt.
is what the power dynamic means. As an adjudicator, do you feel you're sufficiently alive to the operation of that power dynamic?
I believe I am.
And is it consistent with you taking your collaborative approach?
I believe it is.
Okay. And the fact that you're funded by supermarkets, you feel is an adequate way of negotiating this? Doesn't have an impact?
I don't believe it has an impact.
Okay. I mean, you've got a staff of 9 to regulate some of the biggest corporates in the country. Do you really feel that's adequate? Or is it in the corporate's interest to keep you starved so that you're not going to be able to be effective in your execution of your duties?
I have always sought...
Like this, why do you not ask them for enough resource to staff 100 people to carry out these functions?
So I have always asked for the amount of levy that I believe is adequate.
You believe that a staff of 9 is adequate to regulate? To
execute my remit. The Secretary of State has never declined to approve the quantum that I have sought. It's a mandatory levy on the retailers. They have no choice.
So no supermarket has ever complained that you're asking for too much?
No.
I wonder why that would be. Richard, you're the new guys on the block. Have you learned any lessons from the criticisms of the GCA in terms of building trust and confidence with the industry?
So I think the first thing to say,
you're not overstaffed either, are you?
We are a small team. I have in DEFRA 4 full-time staff that support my office. It is early days, and we certainly have expectations to grow organically, certainly as I take on similar powers in other sectors in the future. And the nature of our workload is we are both reactive to the issues and complaints that are brought to us, and so we have to match our resource to that demand. But of course, we also have a proactive role as well in engaging extensively across the industry to try and drive some of the positive behaviours. So I think I definitely recognise a lot of the tensions that you and Mark have described in navigating the role of an adjudicator, the exercise of formal powers, but also, and I suppose I'm particularly conscious in the role that I have focused on trading relationships at the farm gate directly with farmers, to be user-led in terms of the outcome that a
Who's a user in this context?
The producer. So my powers are exercised by a producer coming forward, and my formal powers are only engaged through a producer making a formal complaint. But one of the key issues that I've encountered in my time in the role is the expression of worry and fear that farmers may have in stepping forward and bringing a formal complaint.
Do you see the collaborative approach of the GCA as being one that has anything to recommend itself to you, or do you intend to do things differently?
No, I think there's a lot to be said for the collaborative approach. I think ultimately in this sort of role as an adjudicator, you have a toolkit and a set of options to deploy, and part of the role is exercising judgment in which option you think is most likely to achieve the best outcome. In my own context, with individual farmers raising issues with me about often the single trading relationship, which will be the lifeblood of their farm and their business, there is a significant concern about raising an issue which may risk that relationship going forward. So what I meant by user-led is that farmer will be looking for resolution of the issues, but they will also be hopeful in the vast majority of cases that that relationship can be maintained and continued going forward. So the options that I choose in terms of how I would engage will be very much based on what that producer may be looking for.
You're also dealing with a power dynamic. In dairy, for example, it will be the relationship between the farmer and the company to whom they supply. It's maybe not as dramatic as the relationship that you would have with a supermarket, which sit at the top of the food chain in this particular market. But you're both content with the concept that you can address a power imbalance by an even-handed approach.
So impartiality is at the core and the heart of my role. It what gives me credibility in the industry on both sides. I think what helps is to be able to demonstrate the outcomes you're able to achieve. I don't think it is a binary choice.
It's early days, granted, yeah. But what are the outcomes that you would point to so far?
So I don't, first of all, I'd say it's not a binary choice, I don't think, between a collaborative approach and a more interventionist approach using powers. I think it's a selection of the appropriate approach of the circumstances presented to you. In terms of what we've been able to achieve since I was established, so we've only had one formal complaint raised by a producer, so that's a producer who's prepared to put their name to a formal complaint, but we've had more than 20 referrals through an in-confidence channel, which we set up, borrowing from some of the best ideas of Mark and his team at the GCA, whereby producers are able to raise issues with us with a guarantee that their details will be kept confidential. We won't even raise the issue with a producer, with a processor, unless they wish us to do so. But in the majority of those cases, we have been able to find a way to raise the issue directly with the processor concerned without revealing identity. And we've been able to secure changes to the issues within the contractual terms which were being raised with us. So that's been a very effective, quick and informal way to secure some meaningful changes. Now, I'm also mindful I'm probably being new in something of a honeymoon period as an adjudicator, and no one wants to be the first to be subject to formal investigation, and everyone may be playing nice at the moment, so I'm not naive enough to think that may always be the case. But my starting point is always thinking, what is the best option to pursue in order to achieve the best outcome for the farmer who's come forward with the issue they're articulating?
Okay, I mean, that's a fine approach to take, but it doesn't really pass the test of would anybody support the opposite, does it? Everybody wants the best approach for the best outcome.
Yes, and so the judgment is making sure that you make the right judgment.
Okay, we'll move on to the question of scope and powers. Charlie, you're going to lead the question here.
Thanks, Chair. I feel like I could be sat on either side today, given my role in the campaign to create the GCA and then my role in the pig supply chain regulations. So I do say, going back to, I think, one of the biggest errors, Mr. White, in terms of the way in which your body was created, the fact that it didn't perhaps properly recognise the supply chain and the relationships within the supply chain. Is that a fair reflection 13 years on?
Well, Mr. Chair, as I hope I explained a little bit earlier, I talked to everybody in the supply chain to make sure that I am understanding the challenges and the issues that they are all facing. I understand that some people would support an extension of the GCA remit to cover indirect suppliers, but the purpose of the code back in 2008 was specifically to address the buyer power that the large retailers exerted over direct suppliers. And so whilst my survey results show continuous good improvement in the levels of co-compliance, it's probably not the GCA's place to undertake a detailed assessment of the work that would be necessary to look at whether code-like protections were required elsewhere in the supply chain.
Without wishing to do Richard out of the job before he's even really got started, I mean, could you not have brought all those powers in under one body? That would make more sense in terms of what you both do together.
Well, I think that the way we are set up is very different. Our remits are very different. We work collaboratively together to make sure that we are delivering on those remits. And if suppliers were uncertain about where they should go, we're more than happy to engage with them to make sure that they are dealt with by the right adjudicator.
Right. And just on the specifics, or you've read Minette Batter's recent review, and particularly her recommendations around the cost price increases and so that being enshrined in some sort of statutory way. How did you reflect on that?
So the code is very flexible. It is principles-based. In late 2021, early 2022, I saw that cost price increase requests were being made because we'd had a spike in inflation across the sector. And I was hearing some concerns amongst suppliers about how retailers were engaging with suppliers over cost price increase requests. So I developed my 7 golden rules, which I have agreed with the retailers, and they cover areas such as ensuring very clear communication of the retailer's process for agreeing a cost price increase request, no fishing expedition for information that is not really required by the retailer to make the cost price increase decision. Those rules have been embedded by the retailers in their training programs of their buyers and their buying teams, in their internal processes, and then it was relatively easy to adapt those rules when we went from an inflationary environment to a deflationary environment, and we saw retailers asking suppliers for cost price decreases. So I know that Baroness Batters has talked about enshrining those 7 golden rules in the code, but they are effectively there already. They are operating, and the flexibility of the code enable me to bring them forward in short order.
Is there a concern that you simply shouldn't be forcing producers into such a rigid contractual relationship? It's kind of up to them to negotiate that with whomever they are supplying, whether it's processor or retailer.
So my concern is to ensure that the process by which the negotiation takes place between the 14 retailers and their suppliers is fair. It is not for me to set price. That is not within the remit. So I'm seeking to ensure that the process is fair.
Yeah. Richard, what would your view be on that? Obviously, you're going to be closer to some of that contractual, frameworks going forward in terms of dairy and pigs and other sectors as they come online.
So, I think the reality in the dairy sector and the pig sector that I'm familiar with in my role to date is, one of the very evident things is how exposed farmers are to what are essentially global commodity prices, and how that feeds through the supply chain. Now, the industry has provided some mechanisms to seek to address that exposure. So farmers supplying liquid milk to the major retailers, for example, will be on what are known as aligned contracts, which are cost plus models. But there's a debate in the industry about whether those are a good thing or not, and other farmers prefer the freedom of choice. But it is very apparent how exposed farmers are, and particularly smaller farmers are, to those global commodity prices and how they flow through. What the regulations that I enforce seek to do is to provide much greater transparency and certainty for farmers about how those pricing changes will flow through into the price the farmer receives at the farm gate. So it should be transparent in contracts about what publicly available information is used on which to calculate the price. Farmers should have a much better opportunity to be able to both predict but also reassure themselves that those prices are moving in line with those key factors. One of the things that's often been described to me of frustrations of what's happened in the past is that farmers feel that price decreases have been passed on rather more quickly to them than subsequent price increases. So that's something that the regulations should prevent from happening. But when the dairy market is obviously in a downturn at the moment, when the market turns, it'll be a key test of the regulations, I think, to see whether that indeed happens.
Yeah, and in terms of those regulations, obviously it's all come the last couple of years. It's all new. There was certainly a concern through the drafting exercise that we weren't going to get everything right when I was working on the pig side of it, and that once it came into force, there needed to be some adaptation potentially, just to reflect the reality on the ground. That drafting of legislation is one thing, how it impacts the market, etc., is another. have you had those discussions with DEFRA about being able to adapt should there be any unintended consequences of the creation of your body?
Yes. So I mean, the way my office is set up within DEFRA is, as far as possible, aiming to be operationally independent of teams around us. But we do work closely with colleagues in policy teams who are responsible for fairness in the supply chain. In particular, without revealing detail of our casework, but the insights and learning we get from our casework, but also engagement with farmers in the industry to feed into future reviews. My understanding is that the team responsible will be looking to carry out a first review of the fair dealing regulations next year, by which point obviously we'll have a period of time under the dairy regulations, the pig regulations, and current plans for similar regulations in eggs, which I believe in current timetable are due to be, if you excuse the pun, laid this autumn. But certainly there is a expectation and desire to review the effectiveness.
Yeah, I mean, certainly anecdotally at the moment, obviously the pig sector is going through a downturn at the moment due to obviously the European market being flooded with Spanish pork because they've got ASF in a certain region, etc. And I have heard of practices that reminiscent of 2021, 2022 reoccurring again, where processors renege on contracts, short notice, etc. Are you in a position to act right now with those cases, or is it still cases?
So we are in the transitional period with the pigs regulations. So the regulations will apply to new agreements entered into from August last year. But the regulations apply to the entirety of existing agreements from August this year. So the reality will be, I would expect, the majority of those purchases are taking place under the pre-existing contracts, which the regulations won't bite on until August of this year.
As we all know, there were some issues with the pre-existing arrangements in many cases, which is the purpose of why you are here in front of us today. And in terms of your resourcing, is your team in place now up to speed? What does your team look like in terms of its structure?
So I say we've a small team of 4 supporting my office, and so we do a mixture of reacting to the work that comes to us from producers, also from third parties. So the in-confidence channel that we created isn't just for producers, so we also get others within the industry bringing issues to us through that route. So my team do a combination of responding to those, responding directly to farmers. So one of the things I'm very keen to establish is for us to be as accessible and easy to use as possible. So you don't need to fill in the form in order to engage with us. In the first instance, just drop us an email, give us a call, and the first thing we'll do is have a chat and try and find out, first and foremost, if it's something we can help with. But if so, how we can take things forward and what a producer's options may be. But then the other half of our work that my team help with is planning our engagement strategy across the industry. So since I was appointed into the role, I've been to more than 40 agricultural shows, farm visits, conferences, trade shows, similar number of direct meetings with individual producers, processors, industry bodies, to try, first of all, build awareness of both obligations and new rights and protections for producers under the regs, but also to introduce my office and myself, and so particularly importantly, try and build confidence amongst farmers that we are a team that you can get in contact with and talk to, because I know one of the particular challenges is that we can seem as civil servants quite remote from the realities of the day job and the farm. So particularly important for me is working with key stakeholders who producers will turn to in their time of need and then can signpost onto us.
For the avoidance of doubt, nobody ever needs to apologise to this committee for a good food-based pun.
Yeah, true.
Henry, we've got some specific
thank you,
supermarket
Chair.
concerns.
Thank you. Mr. White, you touched on your survey. You mentioned that a couple of times, both to Mr. Jurson and to the Chair. Because I think your annual survey was released last week, is that right?
Well, yes.
And you didn't, there were quite a lot of small regressions. So if we look at invoice discrepancies, that was an increase of 3%. This is from the previous year. Delays in payment, again, you've got an increase, 3%. Delisting that reasonable notice, that was unchanged, but you've still got an increase in cost with an inaccurate forecasting. So you've been giving answers to Mr. Jurson, Chair, saying you're relying on the surveys, but actually, if you look at the one you've released last week, you are seeing increases in respect of issues that your suppliers are reporting to you.
So the annual survey that we've conducted over the years is one of the most important ways that suppliers can tell us confidentially about their experience of dealing with the 14 retailers, underlining again the confidential nature of the survey. The results that I released last week continue to show a high level of perceived compliance at 92%. But obviously I am concerned that there, as you have pointed out, there are a number of issues where concerns have increased, and also a number of retailers where their overall code compliance score has fallen year on year. It is a critical reminder of the need for retailers to focus on compliance with the code, and I'm determined that they do so. But I think it is very important to look at the context against which the survey results have been collated and published. So they are very different looking at individual retailers. So many of the retailers have invested heavily in new systems, new software, and are transitioning from one system to another. Sometimes there are teething issues when those transitions take place. You will have read about the sector suffering a number of cyber incidents across the last 12 months. Unfortunately, they do have an impact on occasion on things like delays in payment, although I should point out that I'm not seeing any deliberate attempt by retailers not to pay their suppliers. More, it has been an administrative issue. But regardless of what the headline issues are, I work, as I do each year, with each individual retailer, examining with them the detailed results of their individual survey results so that they can develop an action plan to correct the issues which suppliers have identified. So I'm ensuring that the retailers investigate, draw up the action plan, and then as part of the collaborative approach through the balance of the year, I will be looking with the retailer at what they have done to correct the issues that have been identified in the survey. And obviously the market is very dynamic, and so issues do pop up at all times during the year.
And a little bit like an apologist or a PR machine for the supermarkets, rather than saying this is unacceptable, this is what you need to do for compliance, rather than we appreciate that you've got some issues with your back office and with your systems, and this is the reason, we understand that, and that's okay. It seems looking through the wrong end of the telescope a little bit.
Absolutely not an apologist. The survey is a really important way for suppliers to tell me in detail what is happening in their experience with the retailers. The retailers have the results, and I work with them to ensure that they are addressing each individual element. I was trying to explain to the committee that there may be some wider issues that have impacted the results this year.
Do you know why do you think it is that the new entrants have a bigger issue in respect of compliance versus those ones a bit more long-standing? When you look at the surveys and you see those discrepancies.
So what we have seen in the past is that it takes a little bit of time for some of the newer entrants to get up to the levels of perceived compliance that the longer standing retailers have seen and suppliers experience. I'm working with each of the retailers on a proportionate basis to bring their compliance up.
So if we take Amazon, for example, that's consistently performed poorly in your surveys and shown little improvement. And I think you've launched an investigation.
I did, yes.
So why do you think that this is the case? Why is Amazon performing so poorly in respect of your surveys?
So as you correctly identified, Mr. Tufnell, I launched an investigation on the 20th of June last year, a targeted investigation into potential delays in payment by Amazon based on a range of evidence that I had received. It's in respect of the period, the 1st of March 2022, which is when Amazon was designated as a retailer, through to the 20th of June 2025, because I had reasonable grounds to suspect that Amazon had breached the code. And the investigation is ongoing. I will update everybody when I am able to. Meantime, I welcome suppliers coming forward confidentially to tell me about their experiences with regard to Amazon and potential delays in payment or any other code-related matter.
Why did it take you 12 months to launch the investigation?
So, 12 months?
Well, it took from you warned them, and then it took you 12 months from that warning to launch the investigation.
Because as part of the collaborative approach that has been adopted with all retailers, we take the issues to them, ask them to investigate, to improve their systems. But if I am still hearing that behaviours have not changed or suppliers are still experiencing concerns, then I will consider launching an investigation.
Have you got enough teeth? I mean, you've told the chair you've got 9 staff. What was it, 3.5 million?
3.5 million,
yeah,
I think, yes.
To go up against an organisation like Amazon, do you think you've got enough teeth to do that?
I believe I have.
Can I ask, if you go into some of the details about the business model that Amazon is operating, and you think of terms of the lack of access to the resources to discuss or mitigate or resolve issues that suppliers are having, as an example, or you think about their short delivery, strict delivery requirements, that's a very unique type of business model they're operating in this space. If you've outlined a sort of compliance collaboration type model to address some of these concerns, or the way in which you work in terms of your own internal processes, do you think you need to have a more robust attitude at challenging certain business practices, business models within this sector in order to try and gain compliance?
So across the 14 retailers, there are very many different business models. So from the traditional bricks and mortar retailers to discounters with perhaps limited range to online only, such as Ocado, or a combination of those types of business model. I believe that the code is flexible enough to encompass all of the commercial models that the retailers adopt, and we've seen perceived high compliance with the code across the sector, regardless of the business model that has been adopted.
I mean, in 2024, you had less than half of Amazon suppliers reporting they believed the retailer to adhere to the supply code of practice. So that's stretching flexibility, it seems.
Well, there is a process to be gone through in terms of launching an investigation, but I think the results that I published last week showed that Amazon had improved to 69%. It's still not at the high levels that other retailers have achieved.
Well, to give it's 90%. I mean, Morrison's, I think, is 89%, but the majority over 90%. So that's quite a big discrepancy between, as an outlier. So that presumably gives you great... I mean, I know you've launched the investigation, but in terms of to be more active, more rigorous in terms of trying to enforce and make Amazon adhere to your code, it must give you cause for concern.
what it is, and I launched the investigation.
But in terms of looking into what actually the practices, the business model, the mechanisms by which Amazon are acting in the marketplace that is causing the suppliers. And it seems that the collaboration approach that you've taken perhaps isn't forceful enough in getting change, holding the Amazon to account and allowing the suppliers to be able to have trust and confidence in their own businesses, in their own profit.
So the investigation is looking into all of those issues that you have identified in connection with delays in payment.
And can I ask, the Chair touched on the High Court issue in respect of Aldi. Can I just quickly ask, why did it, in terms of you intervening in the High Court case, Aldi was spent significant time and money to stop you intervening. What do you think that says about the supermarket's view of you as the adjudicator?
Well, I made the application in December 2024 in order to assist the court in the determination of the civil litigation between the parties to help interpret the code for the court, which was granted on the 16th of June last year. I can't answer for Aldi's actions, but as the Chair pointed out, the civil proceedings were discontinued after the intervention was allowed.
Thank you, Chair.
Mm-hmm. Collaborative when it suits the supermarkets. I mean, look, Amazon in the United Kingdom has a revenue of £29 billion in 2024. They employ 75,000 people. You've got a staff of 9 and a budget of £3.5 million. Do you really think you're set up to take on a corporate of that size?
I believe I have the appropriate budget to conduct the investigation that I launched last year.
No concern about that at all?
No.
Okay. I mean, I'm a Liberal Democrat. I survive on optimism, but we shall keep an eye on that one. We're going to move on and look at the relationship between you both and DEFRA as a department. Sarah Dyke, you're going to lead our question.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's right to move on at that point. The GCSA's statutory review notes ongoing supply fears about reprisals, limited use of formal investigatory powers and confusion between the remits of the GCA and the agricultural supply chain adjudicator. Riverford's campaign revealed that 67% of farmers fear being delisted if they speak out against supermarket behaviour, while often being left with just 1% of profit from the food that they produce. They're also tied into contracts that can be changed at short notice with little transparency and obviously very one-sided. Do you think the fear from farmers is justified? Either or. Who wants to go first?
So, thank you, Ms. Dyke. Farmers who are direct suppliers to the 14 retailers benefit from the retailers complying with the code. My surveys show high degrees of compliance across the sector, but also in particular categories like fresh produce. I work with those direct suppliers, but also indirect suppliers such as farmers and producers, because today's indirect suppliers could be tomorrow's direct suppliers. I encourage engagement with farmers, with producers. I have, for example, considered whether intermediaries have been inserted into the fresh produce market in order to circumvent the code, but I didn't find any evidence of that. But I have encouraged retailers, buyers and their teams to go out onto the farm to understand the challenges and the risks that farmers face in their day-to-day business.
What does that look like?
What does that look like? Putting on their wellies and going out and talking to the farmers and the producers who are there tending to their crops and delivering to perhaps an intermediary and onto the
their findings.
Pardon?
You heard their findings from that investigation work.
So yes, I have encouraged and I have seen buyers going out regardless of the commercial model that has been adopted.
What information have they brought back to you?
That they have a close relationship with those farmers and those producers. I've encouraged the retailers to consider whether longer-term contracts might be a possibility to enable the suppliers to have the certainty necessary to invest in their businesses and grow their businesses, but also give the retailers security of supply. So what we have seen over the last couple of years is an increasing number of those longer-term contracts. And I encourage all suppliers, whether they are farmers, producers, direct, indirect, to come to me, to talk to me confidentially about the issues that they are facing.
Any changes to how you carry out your enforcement activity?
Where I'm hearing about individual retailers or perhaps individual behaviour, I am taking that as part of my collaborative approach to the retailers, and I am checking back with them that changes have been made.
I often hear that communication is an issue between suppliers and the adjudicators. Do you feel that's warranted?
I would obviously welcome any suggestions that might improve the way in which we communicate, but I am not...
Do you not hear that from the feedback that your team are taking out onto farm to suppliers?
No. I'm not personally hearing that.
We've heard that the ASCA's Fair Dealings Codes and the GSCOP should be more aligned to address unfair trading practices. Do you agree, and how would this work in practice?
So, from my perspective, I'm confident that we are working together effectively in our very different roles. I'm keen to continue to focus on fair treatment of direct suppliers. I hear the arguments for a merger, but I'm not convinced that the perceived benefits of a merger outweigh overcoming our very different powers, our different staffing models and our different resourcing models.
Just recent volatility in milk prices have seen milk prices fall well beneath the cost of production, and we've seen milk literally being thrown down the drain over the course of the last few months. Many in the industry are saying that poor communication between farmers and dairies have exacerbated the problem, and I've met with farmer producer groups in my constituency in Glastonbury and Somerton. They've all said that a single adjudicator would have more teeth in terms of enforcement. Do you not feel that their voices carry any weight on this?
Of course they do. My concern would be to ensure that if there were a merger, those complications that I've just described are overcome and dealt with, to make sure that as a merged entity, it was delivering those teeth.
And how are you going to go about that?
That is not for me. Personally, it would be a matter of policy, presumably within DEFRA.
So perhaps if I can comment a bit more directly in relation to dairy, because that's a particular focus for my role. I think it's absolutely right, the issue raised about the critical importance of communication. I mentioned the fact that dairy farmers are exposed to ultimately global commodity prices, and we've seen that price fall dramatically over the last 6 to 8 months, driven by oversupply, not just in the UK but globally. But some of that is predictable and foreseeable, and I've seen some great examples of processors who've worked with their milk pools and their farmers to provide a heads up for what is about to happen, what's coming down the track. Equally, that doesn't happen on all occasions, and sometimes farmers are left to trying to work this out for themselves, which, if you're a busy dairy farmer, you're probably unlikely to have too much time to do. One of the positive developments I think we've seen since the introduction of the fair dealings regulations is a greater move towards farmer organisation and representation. So in dairy we saw the launch of the Association of Dairy Producer Organisations last autumn, which represents, I think, just under 2,000 dairy farmers, and over 4,000 dairy farmers are part of a cooperative group. So as one way to provide some countervailing power to the greater power of purchasers in the supply chain, I think having that farmer representation organisation is really crucial and helps with the communication both ways, because farmers need information on which to plan their investments and their plans for how much to produce and how big their herd should be. Processors also need to understand what farmers' plans are so they can adapt accordingly themselves. So one of the things I'm very focused on, and working with industry to encourage development of some clear minimum expectations of what good communication looks like.
I agree that the agricultural supply chain adjudicator is a step in the right direction. But it doesn't seem to be shifting the balance in the system enough. And talking to farmers in Glastonbury and Somerton, they're still telling me that they're hesitant to raise their concerns because they fear losing their contracts or damaging their relationships with the buyers. So it's really important that the adjudicator is properly resourced and able to act proactively rather than reactively, because if farmers don't feel confident using it, then it's not delivering the protection that it was designed to provide them. Do you agree with that? And also, with the current trajectory is suggesting that many dairy farmers are likely to go out of business over the course of the next year. How is that giving them confidence and enabling them to plan for the future?
So I agree, it's absolutely critical that farmers have the confidence to come forward and tell us about the issues. But as I've already referred to, I fully understand the reluctance and the worries about coming forward formally and making a formal complaint. The farmers I've spoken to who very clearly articulate the fear that they may have of reprisals, but actually very often it goes beyond that. Many farmers supply a smaller local processor, and the relationships involved may be cross-generational, heavily community-based, and so many farmers express to me a reluctance to raise a formal complaint, not just because of worries, but also the impact it may have on the processor that ultimately is the lifeblood for their business. Which is why we have sought to establish different ways that farmers can get in contact with us directly, including, and really importantly, the in-confidence channel. And farmers can come to us direct. They can come through a farming union or representative, or anyone they want to represent them. They don't need legal representation to use us or come and talk to us. And where farmers take that step and do share details, where possible, I and my team will endeavour to use that information to make positive changes. So we do have examples over recent months where issues have been raised with us. We have been able to engage directly with the dairy processor concerned without revealing confidential identity of who's raised it with us, and have secured changes to contractual provisions accordingly. So there is a lot we can do, but it's absolutely critical that farmers have that confidence to come forward and talk to us in the first instance.
you think once farmers have given you that information, given the threats and the damage that could bring on their businesses, do you feel that you have then? Do you feel that it's really important that that data, that information that farmers are giving you, should be shared between the Agricultural Supply Chain Adjudicator and the GCSA? Do you think that should be mandatory?
So I think where there are issues which impact across our jurisdictions, then we already have good, effective working relationships, well-established lines of communication. Our teams meet on a monthly basis, and I catch up with Mark every 6 months or so. To date, our jurisdictions don't directly overlap. The sectors in which my powers are established, there is very little direct supply to supermarkets. That may change in the future with additional sets of regulations. But to date, I haven't encountered, speak for Mark, but I haven't encountered any issues with us being unable to share relevant information with the GCA. If we did encounter that, then that's certainly an issue that we would look to raise and address.
I think if farmers have stepped up to take that big step, given the risks that they face, then it should only be fair that that information is properly used. Just one final question, if I may, Chair. The move now has been taken to transfer GCA, I don't know why I can't say that, but Grocery Code Adjudicator sponsorship to DEFRA. Do you think it's going to make a difference to suppliers?
So I have had an effective and constructive relationship with the Department of Business and Trade over their sponsorship and oversight of the GCA. I've also worked with DEFRA over the last 2 or 3 years. I look forward to continuing an effective and constructive relationship with DEFRA to ensure the fair treatment of direct suppliers.
Henry, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just, and it may be my own ignorance and lack of understanding of the milk market, but I'm just picking up on what Sarah's mentioned there. I was wondering why is there such a discrepancy between the price that the farmers are paid for their milk and if you look at on the milk on the supermarket shelves?
So the milk on supermarket shelves is for the major retailers almost exclusively through what I referred to earlier known as aligned contracts, which are paid on a cost of production model. The discrepancy between the price a farmer receives at the farm gate and the ultimate retail price will be determined by the additional costs within the supply chain. The milk price that dairy farmers receive for other supply routes into manufacturing, into other products, are driven by the market. By the nature of the product that a processor is seeking to process the milk into, the markets in which it's sold. But the milk on retailers, certainly the major retailers, shelves are defined by the cost of production model.
Is there anything that you can do to protect the farmers in these circumstances?
So the supply relationship between those farmers and the contractual relationship in those relationships that see liquid milk appear on major retailers' shelves, the contractual relationship with the farmer is with the dairy processor as opposed to the retailer itself, and the full provisions of the fair dealing regulations apply to that relationship as well.
There's no role for you in trying to in these circumstances.
In terms of addressing the retail price of milk in the supermarkets, no, that's beyond my remit.
You just thought something else.
Yeah, just very quickly, do you feel that point of origin labelling would help support British farming? Because there's a lot of unlabelled products coming in from New Zealand and America on that point. So
I think it's a clearly expressed frustration amongst UK farmers about the opportunity for imported goods to compete. I mean, it's not an area of expertise for myself in my remit, but I hear very strongly that it's a concern and a particular issue in pork markets at the moment.
Moving on, Julie, you're going to lead the questioning in relation to your role in preventing temporary price increases becoming embedded.
Thank you, Chair.
Topical.
Questions to Mark. Have you seen an increase in the complaints or concerns following the conflict in Iran and supply chain shocks in recent months?
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. I monitor issues across the sector that might strain relationships between retailers and suppliers. What is clear is that retailers must comply with the code, not transfer excessive risk or unexpected costs to suppliers. Cost input pressures are a significant concern to suppliers, but I'm not hearing from many suppliers at the moment about those concerns. And that may not be too surprising because most suppliers know that I do not regulate price. I think that there is also a time delay between suppliers seeing and experiencing those input cost pressures and then formulating a cost price increase request that is made to the retailers. And then thirdly, my 7 golden rules for negotiating cost price increase requests have been embedded within the retailers' processes since 2022 and should be operating to ensure fair negotiation of any price increase requests that come through. And I am reminding retailers of the need to make sure that their buyers are trained on those 7 golden rules as we see a potential increase in requests.
Right, so you're saying that you haven't seen...
I have not, no.
Okay. So should you see price increases, what would you do to prevent those temporary price increases becoming embedded?
So, as I mentioned, price is not within my remit. So my concern is to ensure that there is a fair negotiation between suppliers and retailers over the cost price increase requests that come in.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you monitor whether retailers are using cost pressures to justify practices that breach the code of practice.
So I confidentially engage with suppliers, with trade associations, with people like Richard, so that I am monitoring the pressures that the sector is experiencing. I am ensuring that the retailers have those 7 golden rules embedded to ensure that the negotiations take place fairly between retailers and suppliers.
So what impact could price gouging or dynamic pricing have?
So I think that the studies that have been undertaken in the past in relation to price gouging have concentrated on retailers. If your question is about suppliers' price gouging, that would be a matter for the Competition and Markets Authority to look at. But I think given that retailers have buyer power, I think it is unlikely that suppliers would be able to price gouge if there were unreasonable requests being made of retailers.
Thank you.
Okay, Jenny, did you want to come in on this point?
Thanks, Chair. Mark, I'm really concerned that what looms on the horizon is going to be the biggest test to the GCA because we potentially face the biggest crisis in farming that we've seen in a considerably long time. The war in Iran is already having an impact on energy prices. Experts are predicting that the cost inflationary pressures on food alone are going to be from 9% to double digits. I'm really concerned, and indeed many of us are concerned, that the supermarkets will choose, because they've got prior history in doing this before, to push down on growers, on farmers, in order to maintain their profits, most likely at a time when, as we've seen before, in recessionary periods, supermarkets do incredibly well through their profits. We saw the top 6 supermarket produce 5 billion, I think it was, in pre-tax profits in 2 years ago. Asda and Morrison's didn't pay a penny of corporation tax for that same period. And so we're facing a context where we potentially have a looming crisis on farming, inflationary pressures on food that could be up to double digits. But I'm really concerned that this is going to be your biggest test. How will you rise to that test? And are you concerned, as I am, that you, the GCA, won't have sufficient powers to protect farmers in the way that we all hope that you do and that you should?
So I think that in 2023 and 2024, the Competition and Markets Authority undertook some investigations into supermarket profitability and did not find that retailers made unusually high margins. 2023, 2024, at that time. It is very clear that the designated retailers cannot make any profits from treating their farmers who are direct suppliers unfairly in breach of the code. It is also very clear that designated retailers cannot pass on excessive risk or unexpected cost to their direct farmer suppliers. Any investigation that looked at whether supermarkets were making more profit at the expense of suppliers would be a matter, I believe, for the Competition and Markets Authority.
Mm. You said earlier, to my colleague Juliet, that you and to others, that you will, one of your main powers is the power of convening in order to enable growers, farmers to negotiate. What does that look like in practice? It's David and Goliath, really. And if we have growers and farmers potentially on their knees with some of the crisis that they see facing, how can they negotiate with a supermarket that holds all the power, all the profit at a time of real crisis?
So I believe that the 2008 Competition Commission inquiry led to the introduction of the code, which did find that large retailers had buyer power over direct suppliers, also found that there was a potential upside to consumer pricing through that buyer power. So my concern is to ensure that the negotiations with the direct suppliers are conducted fairly, but my remit does not cover price.
And what does that fairly look like in practice?
That fairly means having a proper engagement with the retailer, understanding the supplier's risks, costs of production, challenges. It might be climate change, it might be the time of year at which the seeds need to be planted, what risks it's taking on, some of the challenges over seeking appropriate labour, getting the produce to the retailer in accordance with the specification that has been agreed, to the distribution centre and so on, and making buyers understand more about those challenges and risks that farmers and producers are taking on.
You've been asked twice in this session if you feel that a team of 9 is sufficient. You said yes. Do you think it's sufficient for the challenges that lie ahead in the next 18 months?
I believe my team is appropriate for the remit that I have, including for the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, great. And for my final question, what legislative or operational changes would you like to see changed and strengthened in order to enable the UK's ability to manage this future geopolitical supply shocks we're looking at now? So everything we talked about just now, you acknowledge the constraints that you have and how you're operating within those constraints. What changes would you like to see brought forward legislatively or otherwise?
So within my remit, I have not recommended any changes to the code. I would not want to see any changes that made the code less flexible or rigid, because it does respond to challenges in the sector as they come forward. as I think I mentioned to the committee earlier, to the extent that there would be a change in the remit of the GCA, then my concern would be to ensure that we had the appropriate powers and finances and resources to deal with that widened remit.
Thank you. Gentlemen, that is all the questions we have for you this morning, so can I thank you for your attendance and your engagement. It's very much appreciated and it is very useful for the work of the committee. So thank you for that. We are going to move on to a second panel of witnesses, so if I can invite you to gather your papers and we will, without suspending, bring in our next few witnesses. Thank you. And hopefully we can do that. My colleagues, just remember that mics are still live because I haven't suspended proceedings. Right, well, thank you very much. Good morning to you all. Again, just for the benefit of those who are following our proceedings, can I invite you to give us your names and your jobs, please? Since Joe's busy, I'll start with you, Rohit.
Oh, thank you, Chair. So I'm Rohit Kaurshish, the Chief Economist at AHDB. So we're a levy board for agriculture representing pork, dairy, beef and lamb, and cereals and oilseeds.
Morning, Andrew Opie. I'm the Director of Food and Sustainability at the British Retail Consortium, trade association for UK retailers.
I'm Joe Gilbertson. I work for the Agricultural Industries Confederation as the Head of Sector for fertilisers.
Well, thank you all very much. You are very welcome. We're going to look at this, first of all, on the impact of the Iran war on fertiliser costs. No, we're not. The impact of the war in Iran. I'm wishing the morning away.
War on fertiliser.
Yeah, that as well. And the causes of fertiliser. Sarah,
thank you very
whatever
much.
You're asking, you're leading the question.
I can do. Yes, so we're going to look at the impact of the war in Iran. So welcome everyone. And maybe to Joe and to Rohit, first of all, could you just give us a brief overview of the issues currently facing the UK agriculture as a result of the impact of the conflict?
Shall I go first? And we'll do a double act.
Yes.
The immediate impact is less on availability and more on price. The Gulf of Hormuz provides a large quantity of nitrogen fertilisers as well as petroleum products. The destination of these has traditionally been Asian countries, but the hiatus has obviously caused displacement activity, and that's caused the hike in price. Our sourcing is a little bit closer to home, normally from the Mediterranean, European producers, and also from the Caribbean and the States. So basically the displacement of the availability is what's caused the hike in prices. If we were to look at what we were probably paying this time last year for ammonium nitrate, for example, it's probably around about £380 a tonne. Where we are at the moment in the UK is we're looking at about £525. And we've seen quite a steep hike in the price of urea as well. Again, sort of prices have gone up from about £400, £420 a tonne to about £650.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's quite shocking, isn't it, really? Rohit, anything more?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Yeah, so I guess the immediate impacts that we're seeing is the pressure on input costs. Mm-hmm. So we know the energy price shock is having significant impacts on fertiliser, like Joe just kind of outlined, and on broader input costs like red diesel, for example. That's a big issue at the moment. where we've seen significant increases, one of the challenges has been around transparency around those increases in market prices. So at the AHDB, in response to asks from government and industry, we went from reporting monthly fertiliser prices to weekly in response to the conflict. And that's been, we've seen strong engagement with that publication. Engagement has tripled just over this period, and it's one of our most visited publications online, which shows just the desire for more transparency around what's happening with input prices. Unfortunately, on red diesel, it's a less transparent market. It's difficult for us to see what's going on. There's official figures that are published by DEFRA, but they adjust the pump price effectively to a red diesel price. But what we're seeing on the ground is actually anecdotally a lot of divergence from those official figures in terms of what individuals are seeing on the ground, reports of challenges with availability as well. So, and then this trickles through to agrochemicals, to plastics, to a lot of the co-products from oil refining. So there's the broader input cost pressure, but like we heard in the last session, we're also, in terms of timing, it's a very difficult period. We've got strong global supplies of agricultural commodities, which means prices are at quite a low point. And that's causing margin squeezes for a lot of farmers at the moment. So it's particularly in dairy, cereals and oil seeds, there's a lot of pressure on those businesses to off the back of low prices.
Yes, and good day. Because I think you're right. A few of my farmers have mentioned about the red diesel particularly, and I think the prices have risen by about 60%. Do you think this is a tipping point for farm viability, and what happens to the UK food production if the costs remain elevated?
So yes, it's absolutely a huge challenge. We're talking about sectors that are coming off the back of significant changes to policy. So we've seen direct payments being phased out. So that's an important cash flow buffer that doesn't exist. There's increased interest we're seeing in policies like SFI to try and respond to that. But effectively, we are looking at a situation where, off a history of kind of low scores on farmer confidence, which we've seen in many industry surveys that have been reported, the confidence to invest isn't there. And that's going to cause a lot of challenges for a lot of those farmers that are on the cusp of viability when they're looking at things like accessing finance, for example, to borrow to service working capital or for long-term investment. And that's some of the key challenges here, which is it's one thing navigating a shock, but when you're looking at the third shock in 6 years, from COVID to Ukraine, going on to the war in Iran now, we can see how that viability is eroding over time. And so absolutely, it's a very key watch point, particularly as we head into next year. And we look at autumn as a key period where we look at the decisions farmers are going to make around planting and cropping.
Or Andrew, anything?
Yes, our concern really mirrors Rohit's explanation of how the market's going to work. We, as a fertiliser industry, need to be supplying fertiliser consistently throughout the year in order to keep up with demand. We don't have the capacity to provide all of it when the farmer needs it. So we need a consistent throughput. And similarly, manufacturers need to be running their plant flat out to be efficient. So in the absence or in the absence of orders, or if there's a downturn because of a lack of confidence, plants basically have to switch off and then remove themselves from the market. So what's likely to happen here is critical time for us is probably June, July time. If we start to see orders dry up because of a lack of farmer confidence, we're going to move into demand destruction. And we're going to see European plants and UK-based plants potentially go offline. So it becomes quite critical. So we end up in this sort of negative feedback cycle of the longer this hiatus continues, the worse the situation gets for local supply and the more reliant we become on supplies from abroad, which are drying up as well because they're not available.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I'm sure we'll come on to it. Obviously, for us, the issues around fertiliser, other inputs, they're just a symptom of a much wider problem, which is really energy is at the core of this. And I'd be very happy to talk to the committee about energy and how that's underpinning the problems and challenges for food prices. But this is all part of that, which will feed into the wider challenge around food prices.
Yes, and I think one of my colleagues will come to that shortly, so you'll have a perfect opportunity. I guess the question now then is sort of what do you think the government should be doing to be able to support smaller food producers who are obviously going to be disproportionately affected? What sort of measures would you want to see at this stage?
I think there's a difficulty in that the value of the products that farmers produce, which is where our relationship is extremely low relative to the value of the processed food. And therefore, even with the increase in the cost of fertiliser, the impact of that fertiliser on a loaf of bread is relatively low because the farmer doesn't get the value from the amount of wheat. The cost is in the processing, the transport, wages, labour. So it's very difficult, but we've asked the Minister for sort of 4 immediate asks in anticipation of demand destruction later on in the year. The first one clearly is support for farmer cash flow and access to credit. It's easy for me to say that, but the reality is that's what Europe's looking at in the moment in terms of supporting farmers. And we need to sustain demand from June. We can't wait for this situation in the Gulf to sort itself out. It's a bit like tapping your brakes on the motorway. You're getting an enormous tailback and then traffic's coming to a halt almost immediately. And then it'll take ages to clear it. So we need to act promptly on that. We need urgent clarity on UK CBAM for fertilisers and ammonia. The timelines that the government's put in place and the Treasury indicate that we won't know until Q4 what the default figures and the guidance on carbon footprints and free allowance starting points are. So if we're going to price fertiliser accurately and start forward buying, we need to be able to price CBAM in. So we need to know this side of June.
Yeah, we do.
Controversial one, clarity on Russian-owned fertiliser assets that are based and operating in Europe. We seem to be an outlier. I mean, there are obvious political reasons why that was brought in, but there are organisations operating that are Russian-owned, but are legitimately operating and producing fertiliser based in Europe. So the question there is, if our Irish competitors can access that fertiliser legitimately, could we? And then the other one is, data is really, really important. And although we're quite good at estimating things, granularity is really important. So perhaps consideration of a national fertiliser recording system. And again, if we look over the Irish Sea at the Republic of Ireland, they've got a national fertiliser database where suppliers and farmers record their inventories on a monthly basis. So you've got instant access to what stock holdings you've got, so there's no doubt about where the farmers have got adequate supplies, where the deficits are, where the oversupply are.
Fascinating. Rohit, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I guess as the AHDB being a levy board, we don't advocate for certain policies, but what we can do is present the evidence and some observations on what the market's showing and what policy impacts can be. And I guess just a few reflections would be Absolutely, as Joe's kind of indicated on transparency, I kind of touched on that earlier. There's a real challenge around when there's acute market impacts, which we've seen, I've listed 3 examples in the last 6 years with COVID-19 and Ukraine, the war in Ukraine as well. It's very difficult to navigate markets, and understand the impacts at both a policy level and a commercial level in the short term, and it undermines confidence quite significantly. So anything that can be done to support transparency in markets to drive certainty in decision making would be really key. So, for example, at AHDB, we have the nitrogen fertiliser adjustment tool. We have a number of tools, a cost-benefit calculator that we put out just to help payers understand, make decisions about actually the cost benefits of applying fertiliser and what the returns could be. We have the nutrient management guide and some guidance around that. And we're doing some work developing an SFI calculator, for example, which is to help farmers understand the implications of getting involved in certain SFI schemes and the potential returns they can generate. So anything that can support decision making at this crucial time and provide some certainty surely needs to be a big focus in the efforts, and at least in the short term, as we head into those key decisions being made for cropping for the next season.
Yes, I think this final question, I guess you've touched on it, because as you said, this is the 3rd shock that we've had. So we have to look at the immediate support, but then also long-term I guess what specific long-term interventions would you want to see from the government to try and help with resilience for any of the future shocks that are coming?
Yeah, but that's probably not one I can comment on, but...
Yeah, I'm happy to. We've had discussions with government prior to the problems in Iran war. Part of the food strategy that's still kind of in abeyance at the moment. But anyway, connected to that, really around the things that put the confidence into the UK supply chain. So there are some policy decisions. We saw some statements around planning, for example, but we need to see that actually embedded in terms of practice so we can start to expand some of our livestock production, in particular in horticulture. We definitely need to address the energy issue, and I'm sure the committee will want to talk about that in a minute. And then probably the 3rd issue is around labour availability in supply chains, and that's both at the farming level and in the processing level as well, and some certainty for farmers. Because if we can give certainty on those long-term investment decisions, they will invest, food businesses will invest in the UK as well. So they are going to be critical to underpinning really the structure of UK agriculture going forward.
Do you have anything to add? Or?
No, I'd support what's been said. Energy costs seem to be the biggest problem from a manufacturing point of view. I totally agree. Having long-term strategies for land use and food and farming and food security are really, really important. And we need to sort planning out.
Yes.
I mean, it's maybe not entirely the aspect of energy that you were meaning, but we're basically just closed down the UK bioethanol industry. What impact is that going to have?
Sorry?
What impact is that going to have? Does it seem like a good idea now?
Yes, that was an unfortunate situation brought about by a tariff agreement, wasn't it? But the reality is, we are heavily dependent on that for the production of CO2. So obviously from a food production point of view, from a slaughtering point of view or a food preservation point of view, it's really important.
Okay, we're going to move on to some detailed questioning on fertilisers in a second, but just before we do, I mean, you've, Joe, given us the 4 immediate asks, the access to credit to help with cash flow, the clarity on UK CBAM, the clarity on fertiliser assets elsewhere in Europe, and the issues around data. You fed that into government, presumably?
Yes.
What response are you getting?
We had a very useful meeting with the Minister for Food Security, and we passed those on. I hesitate to say we've not had a response as yet. It may be that's forthcoming depending on how long the hiatus with the Gulf.
But I mean, you're quite clear. We've got tipping point for manufacture of fertiliser in June, July of this year. And there, do we see any sign of a solution to that? Any intervention?
I speak to DEFRA fertiliser team twice a week. We've not.
I'm getting a picture of a rabbit caught in headlights here.
Yes. We have a very good relationship in terms of feeding information in. We're still waiting to hear.
Yeah. And Rohit, your point about confidence to invest, this comes on the back of a already significant loss of confidence to invest. You're coming in the back of, for arable, 2 bad harvests already. How bad could this get in terms of outputs, food production at the end of it?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, but you could see within the next harvest, you can see real challenges around cropping. But the reason there's uncertainties around that is because the global output for this year is uncertain. We've got the El Nino effect, which is a key watch point at the moment in terms of what that does to key exporting nations. So, to be honest, it can become quite speculative at the moment in terms of, okay, what's going to be the impacts in the immediate term. You could see crop prices go either way, for example, but there's no doubt in the long term there's a question about eroding productive capacity because that investment's not happening on farm.
Yeah.
So I think that's the key watch point here, that these shocks will erode away investment over time, and where the cost of finance is elevated at the moment, it's kind of undermining that investment even further. So we could see long-term impacts on key sectors, in dairy, in crop cereals and oilseeds, for example, in terms of production, as a direct result of some of the pressures they're facing now. Yeah.
Okay, feels a bit like the perfect storm just heading our way. Right, look, I want eventually to get to the point of how this impacts on consumers, but we'll stick with producers for the moment. Jenny, you've got some questions around the fertiliser cost issue.
Thank you, Chair. Joe, this is probably best answered by you, but feel free to jump in. In 2023, the last UK's plant for producing ammonia closed its doors for the very last time, and it was completely mothballed, which means now we are fully dependent on imports of ammonia where we are able to produce fertiliser domestically. Now that means, of course, that we're totally reliant on imports of fertiliser. We've alluded to that and talked about it lightly earlier. What's your assessment of that decision? Should there have been an intervention by the government at the time to ensure that ammonia plant wasn't mothballed, and as we're now seeing it play out, that the consequences of that decision, be it totally reliant on imports?
Yeah. On reflection, I would say that the decision to mothball the plant was made for sound economic reasons, and that's being played out in other European plants at the moment. The cost of production, because of the cost of European gas and actually other energy costs such as electricity, don't make the production of ammonia feedstock economically viable. Bringing it in from the United States makes sound economic sense, just because the cost of production is much lower, despite the additional cost of having to import it. And that paradoxically makes the position of domestic production of fertiliser more sustainable. It also has the advantage that you reduce your maintenance costs. The maintenance costs of ammonia plant are absolutely enormous. The plant needs to be closed every 2 or 3 years for a major intensive overhaul, and realistically, with the margins that were being operated to, it's very difficult to recover those.
Can I challenge you on that? Arguably, that would be the same, similar, not same, for obvious reasons, similar arguments were being put forward for British Steel, but ultimately the decision was that we are best as a nation producing steel in this country rather than being dependent entirely on imports during times of clear economic crisis, global political volatility. I would argue that the same applies for the domestic production of fertiliser. As we're seeing it play out now, globally, we cannot be dependent on an imports market which is so volatile. So yes, there are challenges and there are costs, but supporting the domestic production of fertiliser in the world in which we see it now, not in the world in which we saw it in 2023, would be the right option for it.
You would still have to overcome the cost of gas, which is 5 times more expensive here than in the States. So it's just simple mathematics, really. I don't dispute the fact that from a strategic point of view, it's desirable to have domestic production. I'm just speaking from a basic economic...
I would also challenge that.
We have no... AIC has no viewpoint on domestic or import.
You can say that you challenge that from simple mathematics, but I would say to you that it's the equations that you choose to look at versus the other consequences of not investing in it. So yes, of course, as you're saying that gas, the cost of gas is significant, but you're also disregarding a whole set of equations over here, and that we're seeing an issue with fertiliser because we closed down that plant. Can I move on? Looking ahead, is a continued reliance on, actually I'm not moving on clearly, is a continued reliance on imported fertiliser sustainable? And I think I know where you're going to go with this. I would challenge that it's not. And what would you recommend is the long-term sustainable approach?
We've got 2 issues. You can look at the balance sheet and say you've got your natural manures, slurries, digestates, sewage sludges, biosolids. They produce probably 120 million tonnes of material a year that's available to be put on land. That is used. And then you're topping up with probably 5% manufactured mineral fertilisers. But in terms of nutrient density, those 5% of mineral fertilisers are providing half the nutrient content. And if you look at the environmental issues to do with those livestock manures, because they're so dilute, because they're fundamentally 95% water, they're highly mobile in the environment, and they're causing all sorts of problems from an environmental contamination point of view. So the issue with regard to sustainability is a very difficult one. We're reliant on manufactured mineral fertilisers, whether we like it or not. The question is, can you move to decarbonising them in the short to medium term? It's feasible with carbon capture and storage, utilising gas, and that's what the investment in the States has been all about. The idea of having the ammonia plant built in the States was the fact that you could apply carbon capture and storage on a large scale and start to bring that in. And certainly the factory that you're referring to earlier on in the questioning is looking at doing that this year. And lowering its carbon footprint as a result of that.
US.
Yes. Longer term, it's very difficult to see what the end game is for green ammonia manufactured completely from green hydrogen, i.e. getting away from gas altogether, basically because electrolyser technology doesn't exist at the moment on a scale that's able to render that economically viable. So you know, we're using everything we've got. What we need to do really is find a way of removing the water from our organic manures and slurries, really, to make it palletisable and easily transportable to be used more effectively.
Thank you. I lied because it wasn't my last question. I actually want to go back and revisit the conversation we had a moment ago. I think the fundamental. I think we're probably not going to agree on this because I've heard what you say, but I might bring in Rahit to see what you think on this. The fundamental problem, actually, I have the challenge, and do feel free to respond to me on this, is I think that your answer to me when I pose that question reinforce a lot of Treasury orthodoxy, which is, well, the cost of production is too high, therefore we import because it just isn't viable. You could say that about so much within the agricultural industry, but we are here as EFRA committee incredibly concerned about the future of the growers market, the producers market, agriculture sector as a whole, because we fundamentally believe and agree that the UK is best served. Food security is national security, therefore that we need to support an agricultural industry that is struggling rather than rely on imports for food and produce. And that is an agreed position pretty much across the House, that we need to make sure that we are supporting an industry in the face of cheap imports, in the face of economic. If you brought an MBA student in and said, actually, look, it's just not profitable or viable for these farms to exist, they shouldn't exist. And that's kind of the argument that you're using about domestic produce of fertiliser. Well, on the face of it, it's not economical, nor is it viable. We're saying that it is right for food security to be national security, or certainly I'm saying it's right for food security, national security, for this country to produce its food and therefore to produce the means of production for that food. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. We have a different perspective on it, and I don't question your numbers. I'm saying there's a different argument over here, and if you just went on a numbers game alone, much of the industry wouldn't stack up. Can I bring in other comments on that position about the production of fertiliser within the UK market rather than being wholly reliant on imports?
Well, I guess just as an observation here, it probably goes one step beyond that as well in terms of the UK's energy mix as well, and just our reliance on energy and where that comes from. So I guess going to Joe's point, it's all interlinked. You know, we can't isolate the fertiliser sector as functioning without addressing the energy needs of that sector then to produce, because effectively we'll end up in a position where the costs are too high and farmers can't source the fertiliser at a cost competitive rate anyway compared to imports. So effectively the domestic market has to work compared to imports, otherwise we end up in a position where outside of periods of crisis, when markets normalise, imports become your primary source again because they're more competitive, and therefore where does domestic production stand in when markets function? So there are challenges there in terms of actually how do you ensure the long-term viability of domestic production outside of times of crisis.
Yes. I remember the days when we were outside times of crisis. Essentially, though, I mean, this is an age-old balance to be struck between the price and the value.
Yes.
And you've given a very fair estimation of the price. Politically, strategically for the country, it's for Parliament to decide where the value lies in that. Henry, you wanted to come in then and say it as well.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Can I ask Joe, you set out all your asks that you've made of DEFRA, the conversations. I think you said you speak to DEFRA twice a week. I was just wondering, in the context of the domestic production of fertiliser, or lack thereof, being pretty much wholly dependent on the cost of energy, and particularly the cost of gas in comparison with our friends and partners in the United States, how often do you speak to DESNZ?
They're very difficult to talk to. We are struggling to get clarity on CBAM in particular, which is, as I said, our second ask, urgent clarity on free allowances.
But CBAM sits with the Treasury.
But DESNZ set the parameters for free allowances and ETS policy. And Well, welcome to my world.
Welcome to our world, yeah. Sarah, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just very quickly, just wanted to explore the kind of future if farmers are moving away from fertiliser use, obviously, as it becomes more expensive. How are we going to then look at where those intensive, fertiliser-intensive crops, we're using less of them, growing less of them. What impact could this have on food security and in terms of our supporting our farmers through that change?
Well, this goes back to Jenny's point made earlier, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-manufacturing in the UK by any means. The question is very much a political one, is how do you choose to support a transition? And we've basically decided we're going to make a transition by removing all the support. But that's, from my personal perspective and not on behalf of AIC or the fertiliser sector, that might be premature given events that are going on at the moment, and maybe we need to reflect back on that and say, how much do we place as a society on the importance of being able to feed ourselves, and how important is having a sustainable farming base? Not necessarily a sustainable fertiliser base. Fertiliser will supply the demand from farmers, so it's actually the sustainability aspect is actually around how do you support our customers who are the farmers.
Thank you.
I mean, the point at which the rubber meets the road on this is when consumers start to notice it when they come to the checkout in the supermarket or their local shop, wherever it's going to be. Josh, you have some questions to lead us on that.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think you're right. People at home will be most concerned, of course, about what's on the supermarket shelves and how much their weekly shop is going to come to. That's how all this will translate into the real world. And we saw from COVID that disruption to just-in-time supply chains can lead to shelves going empty pretty quickly. I'll start with you, if I may, Andrew. I'm sure you'd have seen the report in the Times that a reasonable worst-case scenario could see us facing shortages of supermarket goods as soon as this summer, if the war in Iran continues. What steps would you like to see the government taking to try and avoid that scenario?
I don't recognise that premise to begin with, and actually if you go back to COVID, whilst there were some problems with availability in the very early days of COVID, they were as much about could we literally get as much food on the shelves as possible to meet a really excessive demand in a very peak period. The food was actually still in the supply chain, it literally couldn't get on the shelves quickly enough for consumers, and I think that remains the same here. Having said that, what I would agree with is it's absolutely right for the government to be looking at all of the contingencies at the moment. I think bioethanol was mentioned earlier, and obviously the NSUS plant has been reopened to give at least 3 months security on more CO2 being available, which is a vital issue. So I think it's right that we're concerned. I think it's right that the government is looking at contingencies, and we as an organisation are having regular discussions with our partners in the supply chain and government around availability. But as it stands at the moment, this is an issue primarily about cost, not availability.
Okay, so concerns also that have been expressed about out-of-season shortages, you don't recognise those either? You think we can cope?
No, and I take you back to either COVID or Ukraine. It's around strength of the supply chains, it's about recognising contingencies, and they could be key inputs such as fertiliser and sprays that we've already talked about, or red diesel, for example. Absolutely right to be looking at that, but in terms of production, we are not anticipating problems.
Then, just in terms of the pressures on producers, we know that everybody pretty much universally is exposed to the cost of heating, processing, refrigeration, packaging, getting your goods to market, and then you drill down into specific sectors. Of course, you've got fresh produce and glasshouse horticulture that are very reliant on the cost of gas and fertiliser. Sectors like meat and dairy are particularly hit by fuel price spikes. Pork production is hit by the cost of grain and soya, and if you're an indoor producer, obviously energy costs are a huge concern. So given that myriad of pressures, what would be your realistic best and worst case scenarios for food price inflation as we move through this year?
I'm not going to give you an estimate at this stage. It's too early. The market's still too volatile to be able to do that. Maybe as we get 2 or 3 months into this, if we know there's a bit more certainty, be happy to come back or share some thoughts with the committee. But at this stage, I think we just need to put it in the context of we have already got relatively and historically high food inflation in this country, about 3.3% at the moment. We have been running higher food inflation since COVID. Food prices are currently 40% higher in stores now than they were pre-COVID. So our real concern is this will inevitably add costs. You're absolutely spot on to identify energy. I would also add production in that as well, and distribution. Production, by that I mean things like bakeries, food factories, breweries, for example. Distribution, I'm talking about trucks taking food around the country, all of which energy reliant. So this will put pressure on prices, and we will expect to see inflation rise again, just at a point when it was starting to drop. So I think our message is for customers, for food businesses, this is going to be a really challenging time, and not just in the short term. If you look at Ukraine, if you look at other events, it takes about 12 months before we see peak food inflation actually come through for various reasons. We are now going to go into a period of at least a year higher food inflation than anybody had anticipated at a time when customers are struggling with higher energy prices and we've got historically high food prices. So this is a really, really challenging situation for supermarkets, for manufacturers and farmers, but particularly for customers.
Do you think with what we expect will be higher food inflation, we're also going to see higher supermarket profits?
Well, interestingly, I listened to the evidence that was given before, and I'm sure the committee's seen the CMA's analysis of what happened post-Ukraine, and one of the issues there was not only did margins drop at that point, but supermarket profits dropped by 41% over that period. I think what we're going to see is an intense period of even more fierce competition at the retail level, because we as customers have less money in our pockets. We are going to see staples go up in price, and therefore that is a signal for intense competition, where retailers will be investing even more of their profits back into price caps to try and mitigate it. But I do come back to the biggest thing that I'm sure we'll get to. The biggest intervention that the government could make at this point, this was shared with retail leaders, with the Chancellor 3 weeks ago, is on energy and energy support for the food industry. So I'm talking about those bakeries that I talked about. I'm talking about farmers, particularly the intensive livestock producers, horticulture. They need help with energy, and if the government gives that, I guarantee you that will mitigate inflation in stores for customers. There is a direct relationship here between the government giving more support to the food industry and all of us and all customers paying less for our groceries. Now, the one thing we should also remember is we are very fortunate to be in this country because of the competition amongst supermarkets, and all the studies show we currently pay the lowest grocery prices in Western Europe. Do not see that changing, but I do see a really challenging time ahead. And I think the opportunity for the government to intervene is absolutely now. It needs to get to grips with this energy issue as soon as possible if it wants to make a difference.
Absolutely. I think that as soon as possible point is the pertinent one, isn't it? Because we know, although the costs will be felt by consumers further down the road, the opportunity to stop them is now. And are you as concerned as me that when we talk about government support, there's often a focus on electricity prices, and we miss the fact that there are many energy-intensive industries, particularly food and drink, where the price of gas is important, as we said, and so many other inputs, fertiliser, for example. So they need to be looking much broader than just electricity. And particularly one thing that I'm concerned about at the moment is red diesel. That is an opportunity that we have to directly support producers right now and target that support in quite a concerted way. Is that something you'd like to see as well?
I agree with that, and that's why I talk about in terms of energy rather than just electricity. But there are some very simple things in electricity the government could do. It could look at non-commodity costs, for example, for food businesses. Just take those off or suspend them for a period.
What do you mean non-commodity
So
costs?
these are costs on the bill which are sort of not directly related to the actual cost of the energy generation themselves. It's to do with renewables and various other issues. And if you look at your bill and the bill for businesses, quite a large proportion of that is actually in these non-commodity costs. So pay for the electricity rather than for all of the supplements that go back into infrastructure and development and all the other issues.
Else, yeah.
And the other area is, and we've seen this with government, so it has a scheme called the BIC scheme, where it does subsidise heavy energy users like steelworks, etc. It should be looking at more targeted support for really high energy users. That could be gas, that could be electricity in the food industry itself. Because I think if it was to look at those two issues around electricity costs and energy costs more generally, it would make a significant difference to the final cost on the shelf.
Conscious of time, but Rohit, do you have anything to add on the point of government support for to sort of mitigate the effects of inflation?
Not in terms of directly to government support, but just a key watch point will be around the livestock sector, particularly red meat, especially as we approach the winter. So things like housing costs, the energy costs associated with overwinter housing, feed costs. We know we've got a shrinking national herd at the moment in beef, and that's going to be exacerbated by the pressure on costs. Similar with pigs, you mentioned just feed being the key driver there. So if we do see feed costs kind of going up, at the moment the immediate pressures with fertiliser is actually in the grassland sector, because they don't have the ability to forward buy, and they need a good forage to prepare for the winter, especially, and support their production. So we know from the consumer insights work we do that, and we've seen this in recent years, that consumers switch from beef to cheaper alternatives. So you see from beef mince, things like chicken, pork, sausages, fish tend to gain in popularity, and over time that's just going to place additional pressure on that sector in terms of margins and viability. So on the inflation point that you raised, we know, for example, with dairy, there's a significant lag between wholesale prices and kind of retail market, and that lag can average between 7 to 11 months based on the research. And what that suggests is that some of this inflation is likely to be quite sticky going into next year, rather than just a short, sharp shock to food prices.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, I know you said that it's too early to speculate on what inflation might be, but do you, through your members, have a sense of which categories of food might be under the most pressure? Obviously, Rohit's mentioned particularly red meat as an example. Are there any others that you are expecting to be under the most pressure, so that we can make sure support is targeted in the right way? Yeah,
I mean, it's no surprise. It comes back to the energy point again. So look at energy intensive production. At the primary level, you're looking probably at horticulture, some of the more intensive livestock systems, poultry and eggs, for example. And then at the processing end, those big users of energy, so bakeries, food factories, and we saw that post-Ukraine. So everything from bread through to ready meals, for example, was particularly adversely affected as soon as we saw the oil price and the energy price leap after the Ukraine invasion.
I think I'll leave it there, Chair.
Can I just ease this out a little bit? So you're looking at 12 months before it really feeds through to the full impact on food price inflation. You anticipate a situation then where the larger retailers will become a bit more cutthroat in terms of driving down price for competition. So price for the consumer at that point becomes an even more persuasive driver of purchasing behaviour. Which then, of course, leaves us open to the question of what matters more. Do you pick up a piece of meat that's got a red tractor on it, or one that's got a Uruguayan flag?
I mean, I think you captured it really well before, Chair. And yes, there will be more intense competition, but that's driven by consumers. They'll simply have less money to spend.
They've not got the money to spend.
They have not got the money to spend. And I think you mentioned it earlier. We talk about value rather than price, but price is part of that equation. So if you add on, animal welfare, environment, sourcing, etc., goes slightly down the scale compared to the scale of just the price itself.
Mm-hmm. And we'll certainly take away your fairly persuasive, to my mind at least, arguments around energy support now being the way to mitigate that future price increase.
Yeah.
There are those who are suggesting, actually, that an alternative approach would be government intervention to put caps on the price of certain certain foodstuffs. What impact do you think that might have as a policy?
Well, first of all, I think it's totally unnecessary. I spoke earlier about we've got the lowest grocery prices in Western Europe already. So competition is working, again, confirmed by the CMA that competition works really effectively for customers. So why would you want to intervene? The second bit we couldn't square away was how does the primary producer fit into this? Because the supermarket has to has to charge a certain price to cover all of the costs in the supply chain, including the primary producer. So how can it get the money back through the chain to the manufacturer, processor and farmer if it isn't collecting it at the till? This, unfortunately, is just an inevitable consequence where we've got prices at this level and one of our direct inputs, which underpins food price, energy, is going up. It is unavoidable, unfortunately. The best we can do is mitigate it, which is what I talked about earlier. But this point that you can kind of drive some kind of intervention, sort of some kind of 1970s price controls over it, it's just a fallacy. It just doesn't work. And what will end up is probably producers will lose out or producers will drop out of the market. People won't get the choice that they've got at the moment. Leave it to the market. The market works really well. All of the independent assessments of the UK grocery market confirm that.
You put the cap on the price in the supermarket, that then trickles down or floods down through the whole supply chain, and ultimately you're telling us, I don't want to lead you here, but you're telling us that it would be the primary producers, the farmers, who would lose out as a consequence.
Absolutely. It's an unsustainable model. Nobody wants to charge consumers more than they can. You can't get away with it. The market won't allow you to do that. Mm-hmm. But the maximum price you get then goes back into the supply chain to play all of those suppliers down there. If you can't collect the money that accurately reflects the costs of all of the production and the sales of that product, where's the money to pay the farmer at the end of the chain?
Well, you've given us an alternative there in terms of intervention now, in a way that keeps the ultimate retail price down.
And there's other things the government could do that's in its gift. You know, there's things like large packaging costs it could look at. Even if it just suspends it for 12 months, that money would go back into cutting inflation. I guarantee it. In a market as dynamic as this, it could look at how we roll out new regulation. Do we maybe pause for 6 months to allow food businesses, both farmers, processors and retailers, to adapt to it? There are other ways that the government could be effective here.
What guarantees can you give us that you don't see that benefit just absorbed by retailers, still to the detriment of the producers?
I think two things. First of all, you can't kid the British consumer. First of all, the market's just too strong to allow that. The transparency in the market, the ability for us all to shop in one supermarket or another is too strong. Secondly, of course, the CMA, although it did the investigation post the Ukraine war, is continuing to monitor prices and margins in supermarkets. So it will still be there in the background over the shoulder of all of the major retailers. But ultimately, the market will drive this.
Okay, does anybody else have anything to take? Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. That's been enormously helpful and informative evidence for us. And indeed, doubtless will be heard by our constituents as well, because they are ultimately the people who are most concerned about this, the ones who will feel it at the end of the day. So we thank you for your attendance, we thank you for your input. And at that, I will conclude today's proceedings. Order. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. Order. We are delighted to be joined this morning by colleagues from the Groceries Code Adjudicator and the Agricultural Supply Chain Adjudicator. Welcome, gentlemen. Can I just, for the benefit of those who are following our proceedings and indeed for our own official record, invite you to give us your names and your roles, please. Richard, I'll take you first.
Yes, Richard Thompson, the Agricultural Supply Chain Adjudicator at DEFRA.
Thank you, Chair. Mark White, Groceries Code Adjudicator.
Okay, well, you're both very welcome, and indeed it has turned out to be a timely appearance for all manner of reasons, not least, Mark, because you're now going to be coming under the umbrella of DEFRA rather than the Department for Business and Trade. So, indeed. Welcome to the DEFRA family.
Thank you very much.
You're one of ours now.
Thank you.
And quite apart from that, there are, of course, any number of pressures on household budgets coming from geopolitical events, which we will touch on later, no doubt, with yourself and others who are appearing. But first of all, I want to look at the question of the respective roles of the GCA and the ASCA this morning. And we'll start with you, Mark, if I can. Can we just go right back to ground zero and the code of practice? The mischiefs that code of practice are designed to address include harmful conduct such as the retrospective variation of supply agreements, delay in payments and ceasing or significantly reducing the volume of purchases without a genuine commercial reason and or without giving reasonable notice. Is that still roughly the areas in which you are operating?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the code applies to the direct suppliers of groceries to the retailers who are designated by the Competition and Markets Authority to fall under the code. My role is to enforce the code and encourage compliance with the code. The code was needed to prevent retailers with buyer power from transferring excessive risks and unexpected costs onto their suppliers, and the code has led to fairer relationships between suppliers and the 14 retailers. And as you've already mentioned, Chair, one of the examples is delisting as a specific issue, so retailers are not able to delist products from purchase from suppliers unless they have genuine commercial reasons and give suppliers reasonable notice.
And your view is that you've made a difference in that regard?
I believe that there has been a difference. I
saw recently, in relation to a court case in which you intervened, you described the code of practice as gold standard.
That's correct, yes.
So is this as good as it gets in terms of market regulation?
I believe that it is good as it gets within the remit that has been given to me.
All right, okay, so it's not quite the same thing. So what are the remedies then that you have at your hand?
So I spend a considerable time engaging with suppliers to understand what their concerns are, taking those suppliers' issues to the retailers to seek to resolve the issues at hand. Ultimately, if the issues are not resolved, there are various methods